"Good morning, Captain," my mother told the desk sergeant, as if he were the captain of a cruise ship. "We'd like to see a couple of your guests." The desk sergeant didn't need to consult his blotter. A blue circle of officers surrounded Aunties Chris and Marion, who were, somewhat to my disappointment, unshackled. Marion roosted on the edge of a desk. "Someday he'll come along," she sang in a smoky, dusky voice, "and he'll be big and strong." This is an inspired choice to sing in a police station. There was no arrest, no bail, just the mildest reminder from the police to stop at stop signs and carry your license when operating a motor vehicle. A kitten-haired young patrolman told Marion, "Sure, I'm a cop, but really I want to be a singer." She took his hand and brushed it with her lips. "Follow your dream, darling." I sat on my mother's lap in the cab riding back north, Chris and Marion cackling beside us. The second sergeant we saw sure was handsome. Married for sure. You checked his hand, don't you? The lieutenant was a better dresser. Officers get better uniforms, but believe me, said Auntie Chris, they all wind up wearing those funny little golf shirts and saggy slacks. My mother leaned behind my ear to tell me, "I don't want you to think that jail is always this much fun." What I remember of that group of women from my boyhood is lingering impromptu evenings with lots of snorts and laughs, olives and cheddar cheese on rye crackers, the stroke of matches, the tinkle of ice, compact makeup mirrors folded with a snap, high heels under the coffee table, crinkled cocktail napkins with lipstick smudges, earrings pulled out and resting on a coaster, Tony Bennett on the turntable, an occasional crying jag in the orange glow of cigarettes, candles, and streetlights just below the windows. I don't remember, or more likely didn't recognize, profound conversations, but I knew the buzz of laughs and gossip was a fizz that refilled my mother and her friends. Most of the women in her circle had been married at least once. A couple would be again. My mother thought one or two might have preferred women, but in those times finding the right man was believed to be therapy for that. Single working women have children on their own today. My mother didn't think most of her friends would have wanted that. Instead, these tough, funny, and resilient women turned their care and tenderness on the child in front of them. They loved you so. They loved you so, my mother said now. I loved them. I was blessed. But my mother's friends, and my father for that matter, passed on to me a phrase for the kind of man they admired. A classy guy. The accolade had nothing to do with money, business, or breeding. Ernie Banks, who just left us, the great Chicago Cub first baseman. Ernie Banks and my school principal, Mort Reisman, were classy guys. So were Adlai Stevenson, Nat King Cole, Sir Noel Coward, and the man who drove the number 36 bus down State Street. A classy guy had manners. He said please and thank you, Mr. and Miss, and held open doors. Classy guys picked up checks. They left good tips. They dressed with respect. They kept their word. They sent flowers. They apologized personally. They tried to be kind and courteous, even if they sometimes had to be firm, and their best jokes were about themselves. My mother's friends had learned all this by knowing a few classy guys and many who weren't. Mistakes, good times, lonely nights, and hard-won laughs had taught them what counted in a man's character. They passed what they learned on to me in dozens of stories. They gave me something to steer toward. My mother's circle of friends also gave me a glimpse of good friendship. Friends were the people you called at 3 a.m. to get you out of jail. But they were also the people who were with you at 9 p.m. on a slow Saturday night. Friends shared crisis, and they shared what was often the trickier test of tedium. My mother's humor and strength sometimes made it hard to see how much of her life had been busted. But her friendships with such rugged, chic, and appealing women gave her other lives to care about, and gave hers purpose, shape, and laughter. My mother and I were up for about 48 hours straight at one point in the ICU, and we both talked a lot about her friends. We talked about her 3 marriages. We talked about her love of art. There's a whole section in this book because as a working girl on Rush Street, she had often repaired to the Art Institute It was one of the first buildings in Chicago that had universal air conditioning. And she remembered you could walk from room to room or just sit and look and dream. It was like a vacation. There was Gauguin, there was Van Gogh. I'm sorry, this is Marin. There was Van Gogh. I just want to be as clear as I can. I want to forestall a lot of emails that say, Scott, you missed the pronunciation. Outside there were buses and trains and police sirens, but inside there was Tahiti, there was a street in Paris, there was a ballet dancer in her dressing room, rolling on her socks, or was she taking them off? We talked about her old boyfriends, or a fraction of them. We talked about her struggle with suicide, and I hadn't appreciated until we spent that time together what really a long struggle that had been. Her mother had taken her life when she was in her mid-40s. My mother was in her early 20s, and as my mother said, suicide puts a fly in your head. It's always in there buzzing around. You never quite get it out. And there were times that I talk about in the book, as she talked about with me when she was tempted, and at least once where she you might have heard me talking about it on one of the media interviews I've been doing recently, sometimes when she tried that herself. But it is a testament to my mother's endurance and courage that she lived to the age of 84 and sucked every last second out of life. I have a section in the book where I talk about how my mother loved to entertain. Big parties were impossible in the one-bedroom box of an apartment we had on the north side, but she would bring 5 or 6 people around a small round table and set out white plates. She entertained friends to thank them for trudging through snow to see me in a school play. Do I need to explain snow here?
Just rain.
Just rain, yeah, right. She entertained people to console a friend who had lost her job or boyfriend, or to congratulate a friend who had lost her job or boyfriend. She'd gather a group in front of the TV to eat takeout chow mein and watch a world crisis, or the Wizard of Oz, the World Series, or the Miss America pageant. She'd bring up card tables from our storage locker to seat a dozen people for Christmas Hanukkah dinners, because the holidays were fused in our mixed faith household, and she would plunk little menorahs on top of the table among the little Virgin Mary votive lights in Mexican markets, and people would say, Hattie, those are religious symbols, and she would say, but they make the table look so pretty. Isn't that what the holidays are all about? I have a section in the book about what I came to think of as her most accomplished entertainment. There was a man in Chicago that some of you may remember because he actually won a couple of Supreme Court suits under the equal time provision that used to exist at the FCC. His name was Lar America First Daily, and he ran for everything on the ballot, and he campaigned in an enormously tall Uncle Sam hat, and often a full regalia of Uncle Sam uniform. He was considered an absurd figure. I mean, even by today's standards in politics, he was considered to be an absurd figure. I was putting out an underground magazine as an adolescent, and our editorial board wrote letters to every candidate we could see on the ballot, inviting them to meet our editorial board for a conversation, looking forward to, of course, our major editorial endorsements for this major publication we were putting out. And, you know, not even the vegetarians bid. God bless him, Lar America First Daily sent a letter saying he'd be pleased to meet with the editorial board. So we rushed home after math class to our apartment on Elm Street. Lar Daly wore a worn old gray suit with elephant ear lapels for our meeting, but doffed his cowering Uncle Sam hat to my mother when she opened the door. "Ah, sure is nice to enter hostile territory," he said, "and see a pretty face." I forget what urgent question we asked Lar Daly. He said a few crackpot things I can't recall, and several that made our editorial board of sardonic youngsters roll our eyes. "Public schools are a mess," and "the U.S. government snoops on everybody." Things that make me wonder today why we sneered. Lar Daly brightened when my mother asked about his Uncle Sam hat. "You just don't buy that in a costume shop, do you?" she asked. "I can tell from here. The stitching is exquisite." "Good eye, ma'am. Got a Lithuanian lady, works for me, sews it all by hand." I'll go through two or three of these a year. You see, I keep stuff here. He shook out papers at the bottom of his hat, kind of like my office, so I can keep both hands free to meet people. You know, Lincoln kept his office in his hat too when he was a young Buck Prairie lawyer. People laughed at him in those days too, trying to be a lawyer, no education, that squeaky voice, those long legs growing out of his suits. Our editorial board had been in session for more than an hour, and Laura Daly, who did not otherwise invite comparison to Lincoln, picked up his hat and began to make his goodbyes. "I know you must have a campaign appearance to make," my mother told him, "but please don't run off until we've at least given you a drink for your trouble." He did have one, Scotch rocks as I recall, and then one more for the road. My mother brought out peanuts and some kind of cheese with little toasts. "You know, I run a barstool company," he told us. "Business is okay, but the glory days is back when I was young in the 30s. Bookies needed stools. You know why, Mrs. Simon?" My mother leaned forward. "I was a child. They couldn't sit at desks and post the numbers on a blackboard, so they sat and stood on stools. The cops knew where all the betting parlors were because they'd bust them. Well, I'd tell the cops, you give me an address, I'll give you 50 cents for each stool we sell. The cops would raid them every few weeks, remove the furniture, and the books would just reopen and buy more stools. Get business flowing, let me tell you." The second scotch and the reminisce seemed to make Laura Daly's eyes water a little. "But I guess the glory days are always when we're young. Right, Mrs. Simon?" "You were so right, Mr. Daly," she told him. "I got 6 kids," he said between sips. "All grown now. I know people make jokes about me. I always worried about them getting hurt. Hey, your dad's that crazy guy in the Uncle Sam hat. Kids, they can be jerks. But I tell my kids, and Mrs. Simon, I'm going to tell your boy right here, hey, you can't let a little razzing get you down. You got to do what you believe in. Hey, they all laughed at Christopher Columbus, didn't they? But he sure brought home the gold." "You were the soul of graciousness that day," I told my mother now. "With a man most of us would have laughed down the stairs. He was a guest in our home," she said. "I'm not sure I'd want him to be president or even dog catcher. But he sure dedicated his life, didn't he?" "You saw that," I told her. "I was trying to be sophisticated and cynical, like a journalist in the movies, and just saw the crackpot. You were gracious and found the human being." I'm going to read one last section from the entertainment section, because for a golden moment, are our daughters still here? They won't know what the reference means. My nephews sure as hell will. And this is to let you know I haven't always been this age, okay? Some of the same stuff you think is pretty funny, so do I did too, okay? I'm going to read a section here. I think it makes a point at the end. "The entertaining you did," I told my mother. "I figured out a few years ago why. Why not? It was fun. Well, it was just you and me. Dad wasn't around or dependable, but you enlarged our circle. You gave a kind of home to all the aunties and the uncles. They taught me stuff and enriched our lives. You gave them something too, baby," my mother told me. "It's hard to be alone like they were. Maybe some of that's changing. Do you remember Hi's little joke?" I asked her. He had so many. This one was really raw. And my mother said, "Oh, that. Hi was a man, I'll even mention his last name here. Who the hell would know? Hi Samuels. He'd been a former boxer, and he was now a brassiere salesman. Hi, the boxer who became the bra man, was a guest one night when my mother had 6 or 8 people at the table and on the couch, and talked her into a story in the paper about an assistant coach on the Chicago Bears who had such an unruly appetite he'd run out of the team's training camp in rural Indiana to eat raw ears of corn. "Raw," said Auntie Chris with contempt. "Utterly raw, can you imagine? And he's not some poor migrant worker, but a fat, well-fed coach. How can he discipline young men? Raw," she repeated, "utterly raw." After a lot of yucks and oohs around the table, Hyde piped up. "Ah, all that corn silk," he said. "You probably just thought he was eating a blonde." Give me a moment here. This is a sophisticated community. You can understand we were in Chicago. We were, and I'm going to bring it back to wistful, all right? The living room roared and rocked with laughter. I felt my face flush as people looked to see if I understood what I had said. I was about 12 and didn't. But to try to look wise, I joined the laughing until all the aunties and uncles began to lean across the table to kiss my forehead and rustle my hair. I realized in the wash of loving laughter that followed a foul, funny joke I didn't understand, that my mother had made a pretty sweet place for me in the world. I'm going to stop there with the reading. I want to invite any of your questions, and I do want to leave time to sign books. I do believe Mother's Day is coming up. On the other hand, why wait? Nothing says April 15th I filed my taxes like a copy of Unforgettable. I think I've already established the case that there's, you know, life, death, adultery, sex, and a number of good naughty jokes in here. You know, plus I hope a story that peels back the heart of love. My mother had a real life. As I said, it gives me pride and pleasure to see, my gosh, her picture on the cover of a book that's on the New York Times bestseller list. She was not a Bush or a Kennedy or a Windsor or a Kardashian. She wasn't a Hollywood star or a public intellectual or a corporate tycoon or a politician, but she was, as our friend Scott Turow wrote in A Blur, who knew her pretty well, gorgeous and charming and relentlessly honest, a true star at the very end. I've been doing a lot of interviews, and I think a thought has crystallized in my mind that in a way, my mother's greatest gift over the years was almost the genius she had for forgetting. She forgot old slights and insults and outrages. She left behind a lot of tragedies and hurts and mistakes. I was appearing at the San Antonio Book Festival the other day, and there was someone who said, you know, I'm a lawyer, and I could make a case right here for a client to try and get him off for all the things that happened to your mother. I mean, she was the only child of parents who were often indifferent. She fell in love with and married a man, my father, who drank himself to death, and she had to leap out of the marriage before that to prevent me and her son from going down with him. She lost a daughter. Her mother took her life when she needed her most. She married a wonderful guy, a great guy, named Ralph Newman, who unfortunately got convicted of a federal crime. She had a relationship of many years standing with a married man, and had to get out of that because, as she said to me, I couldn't be explaining the facts of life to you and not have you recognize them when they were put in front of you. She was afraid that would give me a twisted view of what love looks like. My mother's heart was shaken and broken 1,000 times. And she often felt lonely and abandoned, and she looked over the edge. A lot of people would have used any one of those events to immobilize their lives, to paralyze themselves, to say, well, it stops here. I can't get over this. I'm going to need lots of expensive therapy. You can't expect me to do anything. She didn't do that. She kept on going. She kept on moving. She kept on living life and giving me, her son, a lot. She lived through a lot, and she left a lot behind. I want to take your questions, Dawn. I want to say, Darlene, did we bring the bookmarks?
Yes.
For this crowd only. Well, all right, I think we also handed them out in Chicago, didn't we? And we did in New York, too. But, as I say, for this crowd only, some bookmarks with some of my mother's prescriptions for life. By the way, I see a man here. This book would not have been possible without the Calistoga Roastery. We holed up in Calistoga for a while where I worked on the book. Clive is back there. You know, everyone talks about the wonderful local coffee shop that no longer exists. It does, the Calistoga Roastery. And I wrote much of this book here thanks to Clive and the Frank Sumatra blend. So thank you very much, and any questions you have, I'm happy to take them for a while. except for my nephews. Yes, sir.
Scott, was it by design your choice not to include photographs in the book of your mother and her life?
I don't think the idea was ever presented to include a lot of photographs by the publisher, so it wasn't a conscious choice. What, Darren?
On the website.
Oh, they're on the website, yes, ScottSimonBooks.com. After you've gone to MarkWestStables.com. What's the saddle maker? Okay, .com, all right.
Yeah.
ScottSimonBooks.com. There are actually a lot of things. Any other questions? Diana?
Yes.
I don't know if I want to do this, but go ahead.
I'll be gentle. I'm just wondering, Scott, you have such a rich life with all your aunties but you rarely, I don't think I've ever heard you mention other children. Were there other children in your life that came from this group of people?
Other children?
Your age, kids you played with, hung out with?
Oh, yeah.
Other than your school, I mean, was there any kind of like cousins or anyone like that hanging around?
I had cousins and friends, and I guess they just didn't enter into this so much, did they?
Not so much with your mom.
Yeah, I mean, no, she knew them all, and we talked about them. In the section I had her in entertaining, I think she mentions some of them. And Billy Levitt, a particularly good friend, mentions the recollection, enters the recollection. Yeah, so they're there. Yes, ma'am.
You have so many memories, such intense detail. Do you feel in writing this particular book that you came out a different person from the one that went into it?
Oh, I think you always do, and I hope so. My wife particularly hopes I wound up as a different yes.
So we should ask her?
She should ask her. Yeah. Well, the book is just out, so give me a little time to become a different person. My wife has been hoping that I've become a different person for 15 years now. Yes, I hope so. But you learn and should learn something from writing a book. But I mean, most of all, you should learn something from life. I now take it upon myself to tell young students there's something seriously wrong with you if you reach the age of 35 and have the same convictions you had when you were 22. Mm-hmm. That doesn't mean that you've been steadfast in your convictions. It means you've been blind, that you haven't been open to the experience of life. And I also want to say this carefully, because we're all at different stages in life. What I think I realized while writing this book, and I think it's been confirmed since we've been through the whole process, we don't fully grow up until we've lost our parents. That's when you understand you're grown up. There are just some lessons in life that only grief for that special person in your life and responsibility can teach you. And I think our parents are fine with that. They know that. They're comfortable with that. That, speaking as a parent, is what you live for. They pour everything they are into us, and then they stand us up on our own. At some point, they take a seat and watch us. And I think that's what life leads towards. And they're happy about that. And we miss them, but in a way we should be happy about that too. Let me call on someone back. Yes, ma'am.
How do you think your life with your mother influenced what you ultimately did with your own life, as far as who you are, Scott Simon, NPR, we all know your voice, but how you got there, and how did your mother influence that sort of road that you ended up taking?
I think, and I'll see what my wife says about that. My mother was more of an influence, arguably professionally, than my father. And people on the outside often, because my father was a comedian, people on the outside often, I think it's easy to infer the other way around. My mother was an old showgirl, was interested in performance. I can't say she said, "Baby, we have to pay a lot of attention to civic affairs." But she was always interested. Her circle of friends, I mean, Auntie Chris, the family Republican, made me intensely interested in civic affairs, if only to be able to argue with her all the time. And by the way, I think she made a lot of sense on a lot of different arguments too. and Chicago under Richard J. Daley. But you know, the thing that I get, there's a sequence in the book that I describe. I don't know professionally what, you know, it's interesting. I now do pieces, some of you may know, for CBS Sunday Morning. And we were, I think, in fact, next week I've got a piece coming on about a chuck wagon. And his name is Kent Rollins. His cookbook may be for sale, although I don't know if in Marin your cowboy cookbook is a big item, but in any event, Kent is a wonderful guy. We went to meet him out in Seymour, Texas, and we were I don't get to say this a lot, we were talking one night around the campfire. Kent was in and he said, well, you know, my daddy was a cowpoke, and so I had to become a cowpoke, and you know, and asking my producer and I and our camera crew from Dallas what, and you know, I wound up saying I have no idea what led to me doing anything professionally, but I can tell you, I like to think of the strong personal influence my mother had, I hope, as in the section you heard me read about what it was like to be a man, a classy guy. And I was so pleased that GQ magazine picked up on this and recognized that. There's a sequence in the book where some of you might know Eli's of Chicago Cheesecake. And Mark Schulman, Eli.
I hate to interrupt you. I just have a blue Chrysler that is parked, and the police are out there if there's anyone with a license plate of 6AKU 524. If not, we'll carry on, but if anyone needs to dash out, it's illegally parked in front of the store.
Come on, fess up.
Carry on.
Yeah, sorry, you will be cited if it's about to happen. So.
Well, I only bail out my aunties. Actually, if you're going to buy a book, we can reach it. So Eli ran Eli Stage Delicatessen in Chicago. He had a cheesecake recipe. His son, Mark Schulman, who I've known for a long time, has actually made it into a national brand. And my mother didn't want to see anyone in the ICU, but she did say, Mark came by the intensive care unit and he brought cheesecake treats for all of the nurses and the hospital techs, to whom, by the way, the book is dedicated. And my mother insisted on seeing Mark, and they had a very nice conversation. And after he left, my mother said, you know, you worry about kids, boys in particular, but you and Mark turned out just fine. And I said, well, you know, Mother, he's done remarkable things with his father's cheesecake recipe. They're even selling Eli's of Chicago cheesecake in New York now. And she said, I don't mean any of that. I mean the way you each have made such wonderful families. He has 3 wonderful daughters, and that's what was important to her. And that's what she wanted me to do. I'm sorry. Yes, the owner of Blue Chrysler. Yes.
I'm interested in your description of her dying as left us. You used that 3 or 4 times.
I'm sorry, what?
You used the term left us to speak about her dying. You used that 3 or 4 times when you were introducing people that that someone had left us.
You know, in the book I say die, but I try and I say die when referring to my own mother, but I try and recognize other sensitivities when I speak about others.
I'm just curious about your experience at her bedside, because so many people choose new language after they've experienced someone pass. I'll use that phrase.
I actually say when describing the moment my mother left us that I don't much like euphemisms for death. Let me add parenthetically, I came back to work at NPR, and Matt Martinez, the producer of All Things Considered, came up to me and he said, who knew my mother and loved her, said, and he sent me a note, and he said, you know, I'm so sorry, you know, that your mother passed. And I said, oh, Matt, it's worse than that. She actually died. I really got the satisfaction of seeing him react like you. But as I write in the book, I did have the sensation that what I said is she had gone on ahead. And I really think for those last few days that we spent together, as I described to my wife many times, I think a kind of door or window had opened in front of her. And she could see something into the next territory ahead. She didn't say there were white lights or dancing virgins or, you know, that all of her deceased previous husbands or any of that, but that there was something there and she had begun to move towards it. I think, in fact, I think for the last few hours, last couple of days really, she partially was already there. And I really do think she and I both began to see it as moving ahead, moving on to whatever is next. So that's maybe why I use that phrase. Yes, ma'am. Yes, please, yeah.
I heard you yesterday on the radio when you mentioned that we only grow up when our mother dies, and that was spot on for me. I had the same feeling. There's one other thing that I wonder if you agree with, and that is that no matter how old our children are, we are always setting an example for them.
Oh, yes. I mean, I'm afraid that's, and something I think my mother made me appreciate is that it doesn't matter what you say. The only thing that counts is your example. You know, and people have said to me, I mean, my mother was obviously very funny, could be very funny, and said a lot of wise things. But I describe a section in the book where right after my stepfather, God bless him, had been convicted, we got into the elevator of the federal courthouse in Chicago, and who should be there but the man who I believe had been juror number 5. Right there in the elevator, going down. And we all developed, I mean, there was just no etiquette book to tell you what to say. And all of us became immediately interested in the scene, you know, just very, you know. And my mother turned around and said, well, sir, and let me tell you, you don't have to be a fan of Orange is the New Black to know that a trial is a wearing process on everyone. And my mother said to him, well, sir, at least we all get to go home and get some rest now, don't we?
Oh my God.
I mean, that is extraordinary to me. I mean, I don't think John Updike, if you'd given him a month and set him up at the Calistoga Roastery, could have come up with, well, all right, Clive, you would tell him to say it, but in any event, would have come up with something but I don't want people to think that my mother just tossed off these bonbons. Is that good, my French, all right? What it was mostly, her graciousness was mostly by example, as it was in the section with Laura Daly. It was mostly by example. I mean, I think that's what our children absorb. It's our example. It's what we do. And if that sometimes connects to something that we say, so much the nicer. My mother said to me at one point, I remembered something when she had once during the holiday season, I think it was, or at least during a fierce winter snow, had given some money to a man who was asking for money on the street, and he'd become very truculent, almost threw it back in our face. And my mother said, well, you know, I think he wants to, you know, he's proud. He's asking for money, but proud. And I'll never forget, she said that night, remember, every time you see someone like that, he was once a little boy who a mother loved, a little baby who a mother loved. And I said, I try and remember that every time. Every time I meet someone I consider an ogre, you know. And my mother said, you remember I said that once? I must have said it 100 times. And I said, well, I remember it at least that once. And she said, you know, that's what it is with kids. You say something 100 times, and you're lucky if they remember it even once. Let me take a couple more questions, I think, and then we, yes, sir, all the way in the back.
I heard you say, refer to Uncle Jack on the radio yesterday.
Yes.
You talked about the Cubs.
Jack Brickhouse.
What way was he related?
He wasn't related, but he was my godfather. So I called him Uncle Jack, yes. You know of Jack Brickhouse? Uncle Jack's home run call. And since Ernie Banks' retirement, no Cub announcer gets a lot of time to develop a home run call. But Uncle Jack's home run call was back, hey! And I told him a number of years ago that I'd heard from a young woman in New York that you could tell if a man of my vintage had grown up in Chicago, because at the moment of highest romantic fruition, we're Nick and John. Oh, your mother will explain that to you. If you shouted, hey! And just about 10 or 12 days before Uncle Jack died, we had been having a drink together, more than one, in Chicago. And he leaned over to me and kissed me, and he said, "You keep saying, hey, hey now, kid." I beg your pardon, Uncle Jack, sorry. Yes, sir.
Mr. Simon, I was going to ask you what it felt like to be on the other side of the microphone on this last book trip, but really I'm more interested in what you think about the Cubs this year.
What do I think about the Cubs this year? Well, let me take the first part of it. You know, it's a little hard to be on the other side of the microphone because you don't want to do all the things you criticize other people doing in interviews. And we have a good friend who's a politician in Ohio who told me once, he said, "It's not a quiz show. You know, you're out there to deliver a message. Your publisher is investing money in you. Your job is to sell the book. It's not to answer questions." He said, "You only answer the question if there's like a jackpot attached to it. Other than that, you take whatever the question, you know, and that's what they do in politics. And of course, we revile that in journalism. But my biggest mistakes in interviews are not recognizing the wisdom of our friend in Ohio's advice. And you can make a lot of mistakes that way. As to the Cubs, look, they've actually spent a lot of money on the field to try and improve themselves. It hasn't worked out so well, but it's the early days of the season. And I just hope for the best. And if not, there's always next year. Let me just take two more questions if I can. If we could. Yes, sir. Yes, please.
Yes, now that you're a world famous author and accepted by Marin County, are you going to promise us that you're going to be on public radio for another decade?
Yes.
No, I mean, I can't promise that because, you know, they might, I mean, it's not just up to me. You know, it's up to them too. So, you know, who knows what the future will hold. I've always tried to dabble in other things at the same time too.
Next Saturday morning is great.
Thank you.
You definitely.
Yeah,
Thank you.
yes, we are at our best day.
Yes, ma'am.
No, I just wanted to comment that your laugh is mesmerizing. It has been for years and years. Saturdays are a very special time.
Thank you. That's nice of you. I wish I could laugh and respond. Yes, ma'am.
I just want to give a note of appreciation because there is often on your Saturday show a time when you say something, when you do the whole piece, and it's what we might have called an op-ed piece in radio or an editorial, an Eric Severide, to date myself, kind of comment. And I feel like you are a lone voice out there in the media, not the only one, but of very few who where there's integrity and there's real meaning and a point of view expressed, and I just really want to congratulate you and thank you.
It's nice of you to say that.
Because it's very important.
Our children have conveniently left the room. They have no idea. Oh, this is good. Could we take maybe one more question about my mother, Unforgettable? Yes, sir.
Obviously, she was an extremely strong mother figure, maybe overshadowing father, and I'm just wondering, as a father now, what are the lessons you felt like you learned from your mother about being a father?
Oh, that's a very good question. What lessons did I learn from my mother about being a father? I should probably punt that one to my wife.
St. Joseph.
Pardon me, what?
St. Joseph.
St. Joseph, thank you for, all right, so I'm wearing a St. Joseph, I won't, all right, so. All right. I'm wearing, it's like, as Robert Siegel said, it looks like the contents of a Jerusalem souvenir shop here. I have, what do we call this? Not an ad, what do we call this, Darryl? Pardon me?
Dog tag.
Well, dog, but what you gave me that says a message of endearment on it from my wife.
Papyrus.
A what?
Papyrus.
Papyrus. Papyrus is that. And I have something that is a Star of David and a crucifix for the obvious reason. And I have a St. Joseph medal. My mother said to me, you should take St. Joseph for your patron saint. And I said, why? Because he was a Jewish father who thought his kid walked on water. And she smiled and she said, no, because he was a Jewish father who loved the child who was put in his arms and believed everything that his wife told him. I mean, actually, on the bookmark, there might be the most valuable things that I learned. Why read them here? Make people buy the book and get the bookmark. But in any event, write thank you notes, tip well, sing, drink responsibly, remember that good manners cost nothing and open doors, reach out to someone who is lonely, make them laugh, help people smile. Well, thank you very much for this.